The stagecoach hit a rut somewhere outside of Billings, and Abigail Turner grabbed the leather strap above the window so hard her knuckles went white. Pain cracked through her left side like a whip. Sharp, mean, the kind that stole breath before you even had a chance to brace for it. She pressed her lips together and stared straight ahead at the woman across from her, a heavy-set widow named Mrs. Fenton, who had been asleep for the last 40 miles and was snoring with her mouth open and her hat knocked sideways. Abigail envied her the sleep. She hadn't slept more than a few hours at a stretch since St. Louis. Before that, Pittsburgh. Before that, a farmhouse in western Pennsylvania where she'd hidden in a root cellar for 2 days, eating dried apples and listening to men ask her brother-in-law questions about where she might have gone. The memory of those footsteps above her head was still more real to her than anything outside this window. The pale brown grass, the mountains sitting low on the horizon, like something painted there by a man who'd never actually been to Montana and was only guessing at the shapes. She breathed carefully. Small breaths. The ribs on her left side had been cracked since February, and while they'd knit together somewhat in the months since, the long sitting and the rough roads had done them no favors. The stage driver, a sunburned man named Hicks, who smelled of tobacco and old coffee, had offered to let her ride on the box beside him when she'd boarded in Billings, said the inside was rough on a lady. She'd declined. Better the pain than the exposure. Better to suffer quietly where no one could see her face. That had been her philosophy for the better part of 3 years. She looked down at the letter in her lap. She'd read it so many times the fold lines had gone soft, the paper nearly translucent at the creases. The handwriting was plain and careful, a man's hand unused to letters, pressing too hard with the pen. Miss Turner, I am not a man who writes well, so I will keep this short. I have a working ranch outside Harlow Creek, Montana, 640 acres, cattle operation, good well, solid house, though it needs some work on the east wall before winter. I am 34 years old and in reasonable health. I have no children. The man who runs the matrimonial agency in Chicago says you are 26 and capable, and that you are looking for a new start somewhere far from where you've been. I understand something about that. If you are willing to come, I will pay your fare and have you met at the Harlow Creek station. You would not owe me anything for coming. If you arrive and decide against it, I will put you up at the boarding house and you can go wherever you like. I am not the kind of man who holds people to things they don't want. My name is Colton Briggs. She'd read that last part 100 times. I am not the kind of man who holds people to things they don't want. She didn't know if it was true. She had believed things about men before, things they'd said about themselves, and those beliefs had cost her considerably. But she'd run out of options. That was the honest truth of it. She'd run out of money, out of places to hide, out of relatives willing to take the risk of having her under their roof when the Harmon family name still carried weight in 3 states. Going west had been the one direction no one expected. Getting married, actually, legally married, was the one arrangement that might make her hard enough to follow that the cost would outweigh the satisfaction. She hoped. The stage slowed. Through the window, she could see a town assembling itself out of the brown landscape. A main street, a livery, a general store with a faded awning, a church with a crooked steeple, and a scattering of houses climbing the low hill behind it. A hand-painted sign nailed to a fence post read, Harlow Creek, Montana Territory. Population 312. 312 people. Half the size of the neighborhood she'd grown up in. Mrs. Fenton woke with a snort and blinked at the window. "Oh," she said, "we're here." "Yes, ma'am." "You meeting someone?" "Yes, ma'am." The widow squinted at her with the kind of curiosity that passed for friendliness in strangers. "Husband?" Abigail folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. Something like that. Dunked. The stage stopped in front of a building that served as both post office and stage depot, and Hicks climbed down to let the steps out. Abigail waited for Mrs. Fenton to descend first, then gripped the door frame and stepped down carefully, keeping her left side from twisting. The pain came anyway, as it always did. A dull grind followed by a sharper note when her foot hit the ground. She stood on the packed dirt street and breathed through it. The air smelled of horse and wood smoke and something mineral she couldn't name. Cold and clean in a way Pittsburgh had never been. She looked around. A few people on the street, a man loading flour sacks into a wagon, a woman in a good dress talking to the postmaster in the doorway. And standing to the left of the depot, leaning with one shoulder against the hitching post and his hat in his hands, a man watching her. He was taller than she'd imagined, lean but not thin, the kind of lean that came from work, not absence. Dark hair going a little gray at the temples, a jaw that needed shaving, a canvas coat with a tear in the left elbow that someone had mended badly. He wasn't handsome in any conventional way. His nose had been broken at least once, maybe twice, and his mouth sat in a line that looked like it hadn't moved much recently. But he was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not the appraisal she'd expected, not the quick head-to-toe inventory she'd braced herself for. Just looking, the way a man looked when he was trying to figure out if he'd said the wrong thing in a letter. She walked toward him. He straightened off the post. "Miss Turner?" "Mr. Briggs." They stood 3 feet apart. Up close he had gray eyes, very direct, and the backs of his hands were badly weathered. He was holding his hat with both hands now, turning it by the brim. "You had a long trip," he said. "I did." "Can I carry your bag?" She had one bag, a worn leather case she'd bought secondhand in Chicago. She handed it to him. He took it without comment on its weight, which wasn't much. "There's a restaurant on the main street," he said. "Decent food. If you're hungry, we could eat before the drive out to the ranch. It's about an hour." "That would be fine." He nodded. He didn't offer his arm, and she was glad of it. They walked side by side along the dirt street, and if the people they passed looked at them, at her, at the size of her, at the unfamiliar woman in the city coat, Colton Briggs didn't acknowledge it. He just walked. Not fast, not slow, just at a pace she could keep without being asked to hurry. That, she thought, was something. The restaurant was called May's, which was painted above the door in blue letters, and May herself turned out to be a small, energetic woman in her 50s who brought coffee before they'd even settled into their chairs and asked Abigail where she was from with the cheerful directness of someone who had decided on principle to like strangers. "Pennsylvania," Abigail said. "Long way." "Yes." "First time out west?" "Yes." May looked at Colton. "She talks as much as you do. That'll be a good match." She laughed at her own joke and went back behind the counter. Colton looked at the table. "She means well. I can tell." Silence. Not an uncomfortable one exactly, but present. Abigail wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at him. He was looking at his own cup. "I want to ask you something directly," she said. "If that's all right." He looked up. "Go ahead." "The letter said you understood about needing a new start somewhere far from where you'd been. I didn't take that as an idle phrase. I took it as meaning you'd thought about it." Something moved in his face. Not discomfort, but something more like recognition. "That's fair," he said. "I have things in my past I didn't put in the letter to the agency. Things I'll tell you about when I'm ready to, but not today and not yet. And I need to know if that's something you can live with for a while." Not knowing. He was quiet long enough that she thought she'd made a mistake being direct. Then he said, "I didn't put everything in my letter either." "I didn't think you had. So I suppose we're even." She nearly smiled. "I suppose so." May brought eggs and biscuits and a pot of jam, and they ate mostly in silence, and the silence was the most comfortable Abigail Turner had felt in longer than she could accurately remember. The ranch was an hour's drive in a wagon over a road that was mostly 2 ruts in the grass, and every bump made her jaw tighten, though she kept it off her face. The land opened up the farther they got from town. Bigger sky, longer grass, the mountains sitting closer and more real than they'd looked from the stagecoach window. There was something almost oppressive about the scale of it, if you let yourself think about it. So Abigail looked at the individual things instead. A hawk on a fence post, a stand of cottonwoods following a creek, the way the late afternoon light hit the hills and made them look like they were lit from inside. Colton drove without talking much, which she appreciated. Once he pointed to a ridgeline and said, "That's the northern boundary of the property." And once he said, "Spring's wet here, you'll want boots, not shoes." And both times she nodded and he let it rest there without expanding. The house came into view around a low bend, a 2-story structure, wood frame, white paint going gray, a covered porch running the length of the front, Solid. Not elegant, not a thing to show off, just a house built to last. Behind it a barn, a smaller outbuilding, a fence line running off in two directions. Two men were working near the barn. They stopped and looked at the wagon. "Heck and Darnell," Colton said. "They work the ranch with me. Good men. They won't trouble you." She looked at them. One was older, white-haired, with the build of a man who'd worked outdoors his entire life. The other was young, maybe 20, with the kind of face that still showed everything he thought. The young one, Darnell, she learned later, looked at her with unconcealed curiosity and then looked at Colton with an expression that said, "Well, you didn't mention that without saying it." The older one, Heck, just nodded at her and went back to what he'd been doing. She appreciated Heck immediately. Colton showed her the house. It was clean, which she hadn't entirely expected. Sparse, but clean, the floors swept, the windows not filmed with grime. The kitchen was functional. The sitting room had a good fireplace. He showed her the room he'd set aside for her, separate from his, at the end of the hall, with a bed and a washstand and a window that faced east toward the mountains. "It's not much," he said from the doorway. "It has a door that closes," she said. He looked at her. "It does." "Then it's enough," he adds. She did not tell him about the ribs that first night or the second. She managed carefully, slower getting up from chairs than she might have, avoiding the heavier lifting, keeping her left side turned away when the pain was visible on her face. She wasn't sure she was fooling him. He had watchful eyes. But he didn't ask and she didn't offer. What she did do was work. She knew how to cook, had done it for years in a household that demanded it, and she took over the kitchen on the third morning without being asked. And Colton accepted this the way he seemed to accept most things. Without ceremony, with a quiet nod that said thank you, without spending the word on it. She started keeping the accounts because she found the ledger on the kitchen table one morning, and the arithmetic in it was wrong in two places, and she fixed them before she'd entirely decided to. She kept the house, learned the rhythm of the place, talked to Heck when he came in for water, and gradually understood the shape of the ranch, the cattle, the grazing rotation, the fence line that needed repair before the snow hit. She was useful. She had been useful before in other places, for other people, and had received very different things for it. Here, usefulness seemed to be simply received, as if it were natural, as if she were simply a person contributing to a household rather than a weight being tolerated. It was disorienting. On the fifth evening, she came into the kitchen to find Colton standing at the counter, reading the ledger she'd been correcting. She stopped in the doorway. "The column totals were off," she said, "from last March." He turned a page. "I know. I could never find where." The entry for the billing sale in April had a transposition, $8, written as 80. He looked up. "You found that by reading it once." "I'm good with numbers." He set the ledger down. "Where'd you learn accounts?" She considered. "My father. He was a solicitor. He had a practice in Pittsburgh. He taught me to read contracts when I was 12 because he said it was the most useful thing he could give me." She paused. He was probably right. Colton was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Darnell's been doing the accounts. He's not bad, but he's not careful. I noticed. If you wanted to take them over, I'd appreciate that." She looked at him. He wasn't offering it as charity or condescension. He was offering it because she was clearly better at it than the alternative. "All right," she said. "What?" It was in the second week that she found the document. She hadn't been looking for anything. She'd been organizing the papers on the kitchen table. Colton kept his papers in a pile that mixed receipts, correspondence, and what appeared to be random notes to himself about fence posts. When she found a folded letter at the bottom of the stack with a county seal on it, she almost put it back. Then she read the first line. "Notice of survey dispute, Harlow Creek County Assessor's Office, regarding property boundary along the eastern ridge of the Briggs Ranch." She sat down and read the rest of it. It was a survey notice, which on its surface meant nothing. Boundary disputes happened. But the language inside was peculiar. The notice claimed that an 1874 survey had established a boundary line 80 yards east of where Colton's deed described it, which would place roughly 40 acres of his eastern grazing land inside an adjacent parcel currently under administrative review by the county assessor's office. The notice was signed by someone named Regional Land Commissioner D.R. Whitmore, and it requested that Colton Briggs appear before the commission no later than October 14th to present any countervailing documentation. October 14th was 11 days away. She put the letter on top of the pile where Colton would see it, and then went to find him. He was in the barn repairing a harness, working by lamplight in the early dusk. She stood in the doorway and held up the letter. "Did you read this?" He looked at it. "Which one's that?" "Survey dispute notice. From the county assessor, October 14th hearing." He set the harness down and took the letter. Read it standing up, jaw tight. "Son of a..." He stopped himself, handed it back. "Whitmore. You know him." "I know of him. He's been at the Alderman Ranch twice this year. Heck mentioned it. The Aldermans lost 6 acres of their south pasture to a..." He stopped. "Administrative review. That's what this says. The Aldermans didn't fight it. Old man Alderman's about 70, and he didn't have the energy." Colton's voice was flat, in the way voices went when anger was being kept on a very short leash. "This is my eastern ridge. That's the best winter grazing I have. I lose that. I'm moving cattle off the property in November." Abigail looked at the letter again. "Do you have your original deed?" "Somewhere." "And the survey from when you filed your land claim?" "Should be." "Get them," she said. He looked at her. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "my father was a solicitor for 30 years. I sat in his office from the age of 12 reading land documents. I know what a fraudulent survey claim looks like. Get me the original documents and let me look at them." He studied her for a moment, not the way men looked at her usually, not weighing her size or her history or deciding how much credibility to assign her. Just looking, the way he had when she stepped off the stagecoach, as if he was determining whether he believed her. "All right," he said. They spent that evening at the kitchen table. Colton brought out a wooden box from under his bed that held the documents. The original land claim filed in 1871, the county deed from 1873, and a survey conducted by a man named Josiah Pratt that spring. Abigail read every page. She read them slowly, the way her father had taught her, and she made notes on a piece of paper while Colton sat across from her and drank coffee and didn't interrupt. At 9:30, she looked up. "The 1874 survey, Whitmore's notice references," she said. "Do you have a copy of it? Or any notice that it was ever conducted?" "No." "Did you receive any notice that a survey was being done on your land in 1874? "No." "Do you know anyone who was on your land in 1874 who might have been a surveyor?" He thought about it. "There were some men, spring of 74, claimed to be from the railroad, checking for a potential line. I let them on the eastern ridge." Abigail set her pen down. "They weren't from the railroad," she said. He looked at her. "This is a manufactured boundary," she said, keeping her voice even. "Someone came out to your land in 1874, created a fraudulent survey, filed it with the county, and Whitmore, or someone working with Whitmore, has been waiting to use it. The Alderman land was probably the same. It's not one incident, it's a pattern." Colton was very still. "Who benefits from the eastern ridge?" "I don't know yet, but 40 acres of winter grazing land adjacent to a county administrative parcel, someone wants it. Someone who has enough reach in the county assessor's office to manufacture documentation." She looked at him. He was staring at the deed in his hands. "We have 11 days, she said. He looked up. "We. Unless you'd prefer to handle it yourself." The silence lasted about 3 seconds. Then he said, "No, I wouldn't prefer that." "Then we need to find Josiah Pratt, the surveyor who did my original claim. If he's still alive, and we can get a statement from him about the measurements he made in 73, and if we can find anyone who saw those railroad men in 74, we can present a direct contradiction of the manufactured survey in front of the commission." She paused. "It won't be easy. Whitmore will have friends on that commission. He'll have more than friends." "I know." She folded her hands on the table. "But the document he's using has errors in it. 2 of them. The kind of errors a man makes when he's inventing measurements rather than taking them." Colton stared at her. "You found that by reading it once." "I found it by reading it carefully. There's a difference." She slid the survey notice across the table to him and pointed to a line of figures. The elevation marker on the eastern ridge is listed at 4,240 feet. Your original survey from Pratt has it at 4,180. That's 60 feet of air on a fixed geological point. Elevations don't change, Mr. Briggs. Whoever wrote this number either didn't have the real survey in front of them or assumed no one would check. He looked at the numbers, back at her. My father used to say, Abigail said, that fraud always left fingerprints. The fraudster just assumed no one was looking closely enough. Colton set the paper down. He was quiet for a long moment, and in the quiet she could hear the wind picking up outside, moving across the grass, rattling the east window she'd been meaning to mention needed caulking. I'm going to ask you something, he said. All right. Not about the land. About you. She felt it, the small tightening in her chest that happened when people asked things, the bracing. She kept her face still. You're not just a woman who learned some accounts from her father, he said. Not accusing, just naming a thing. You read that survey in 10 minutes and found 2 errors that I'd been sitting on for 11 days and didn't see anything wrong with. You know how these documents work. The legal part of it. Yes. So why? He stopped. Tried again. Why the matrimonial agency? You could have been a secretary, a bookkeeper, something in a city. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, carefully, I left a situation that made working in a city very difficult. He heard the way she said it. She could see him hear it. All right, he said, and he didn't push it any further. She gathered up the papers, organized them into the box, and set it on the counter where neither of them would lose it. Outside, the Montana wind moved across the grass in the dark, and the mountains stood where they always stood, and the ranch was quiet except for the occasional shift of cattle in the pen. She stood at the kitchen window for a moment before turning down the lamp. She wasn't sure what she'd found here. She knew what she'd arrived carrying: fear dressed in practicality, survival dressed in composure. She knew the weight of it, the cracked ribs, and the heavier things beneath them. The wariness that had become so habitual, she didn't always notice it anymore. But she was useful here. She was seen here in the straightforward way that work was seen, without conditions, without owing something for it afterward. That wasn't nothing. That might, she thought cautiously, be quite a lot. She turned down the lamp and went down the hall, and the house settled around her into its ordinary nighttime sounds. And for the first time in a very long time, Abigail Turner did not lie awake listening for footsteps. She slept. Josiah Pratt was not dead, which was the first piece of luck they'd had. He was, however, living 32 miles north of Harlow Creek in a one-room cabin that could only be reached by a trail that turned to mud after the first frost. And the first frost had come 4 days ago. Heck said he knew the way. Colton said they'd leave at first light. Abigail said she was coming too, and both men looked at her in the particular way men looked when they'd already decided to argue and were just figuring out how to start. I need to talk to him myself, she said. She was standing at the kitchen counter rolling out biscuit dough because the conversation was easier to have when her hands were doing something and she wasn't looking directly at either of them. I know what questions to ask. You don't. It's a hard ride, Colton said. I've had hard rides. The trail's... Mr. Briggs. She pressed the cutter into the dough. I found the errors in the survey. I know what Pratt's statement needs to say to make them admissible as contradiction. You can take me on the horse or I can borrow the wagon, but I'm going. A silence. Then Heck, who was leaning in the doorway with his coffee, said, She's got a point, Colt. Colton looked at Heck. Heck looked at the ceiling. Fine, Colton said. First light. She didn't say anything else about it. She put the biscuits in the pan and slid them into the oven, and that was that. What she didn't say, and didn't plan to say, was that the ride north would cost her. The ribs had been better this week. Still there, a background ache, but manageable. And a 32-mile ride on frozen trail would set them back. She knew this. She'd decided it didn't matter enough to stop her, and she'd been making that calculation, what pain is worth what outcome, for years. She was very good at it by now. They left before sunup, Heck on his roan, and Abigail and Colton on the big bay that was Colton's best trail horse. She sat behind him, which she hadn't anticipated and didn't comment on, because the wagon would have taken twice as long, and she'd been the one to say she was coming. She held on to the back of the saddle, not to him, and kept her left side as still as she could, and watched the sky go from black to dark blue to the pale gray of early morning over the Montana hills. Colton rode carefully. She noticed it, the way he kept the horse to the smoothest part of the trail, skirting the worst of the frozen ruts without announcing that he was doing it. It could have been habit. She suspected it wasn't entirely habit. Heck rode ahead, navigating by landmarks she couldn't read. A particular rock formation, a dry creek bend, a pair of cottonwoods that had grown together at the base. 2 hours in, when the cold had gotten serious, and her breath was fogging and the pain in her side had settled into a steady protest she was successfully ignoring. They came over a low ridge and she saw the cabin below. It was small. A kitchen garden gone to frost on one side, a wood stack on the other, smoke coming from the chimney. "He's home," Heck said, unnecessarily. Josiah Pratt turned out to be 71 years old, wide as a barrel, with a white beard that hadn't been trimmed since summer, and eyes that were still sharp as anything behind the lines of his face. He answered the door with a rifle, saw Heck, and put it down. "Heck Caudell," he said. "You're not dead." "Not yet," Heck said. "Who are these people?" "This is Colton Briggs. He filed a claim in 71 out of Harlow Creek. You surveyed it in spring of 73. Pratt looked at Colton, then at Abigail. "What happened to your land?" "Someone's trying to take 40 acres of it," Colton said. Pratt looked at Abigail again, more carefully. "Who are you?" "Abigail Turner," she said. I assist Mr. Briggs with his legal matters." "You a lawyer?" "No, but my father was." Pratt grunted and stepped back from the door. "Come in then. Coffee's on." The inside of the cabin was warm and cluttered in the way of a man living alone who had stopped caring what it looked like. Stacked books, survey equipment taking up one wall, a drafting table covered with maps. Pratt poured coffee without asking if they wanted it and sat down across from Abigail at the table with the look of a man who had been waiting for someone to bring him a problem worth solving. She put the documents in front of him. He put on a pair of spectacles and read. Pratt didn't say anything for a long time. She waited. Colton and Heck stood near the door with their coffee and waited too, and the only sound was the fire and the wind pressing against the one small window. Then Pratt said, "This survey's wrong." "I know," Abigail said. "Where do you see it?" He put his finger on the elevation marker. 4,240 feet. I had this ridge at 4,180. I remember it because I'd just surveyed a parcel over near Elkhorn that was 4,240, and I double-checked the number because I didn't want to confuse the records. He tapped the paper. "This isn't my number, and this isn't my notation style, Keith. Look, I always put the degree mark after the bearing reading. Whoever wrote this didn't do it." Abigail felt something settle in her chest. Confirmation. The specific kind, the kind that would hold up. "Would you be willing to put that in a written statement?" she asked. "Attested with your surveyor's credentials and seal, stating that the 1874 survey document does not match your original measurements and does not match your professional notation practices." Pratt looked at her over his glasses. "Who's Whitmore working for?" Colton answered. "Don't know yet." "You know what he did with the Alderman place?" "I heard something about it. He did the same thing to a man named Geller over in the Eastern Valley 2 years back. Only Geller didn't know to fight it, so he just sold cheap and moved on." Pratt took off his glasses and cleaned them on his shirt. "That's the game. You manufacture the dispute, the rancher doesn't want the fight or can't afford it. You buy the land for nothing through some proxy or just absorb it into county administrative hold, where it sits until someone with connections claims it." "Who has those connections?" Abigail asked. Pratt put his glasses back on. "That's the question." He looked at her steadily. "You're not from here." "No." "You know how this kind of thing works." "I've seen it work differently, but the mechanism is familiar." He looked at her for another moment, and she had the feeling he was reading something in her face, something he had the experience to recognize. Then he nodded slowly. "I'll write the statement," he said. "Give me an hour." What? On the ride back, with Pratt's statement folded inside Abigail's coat pocket, Colton was quiet for the first few miles. She'd gotten used to his quiet, the way it worked differently than other men's silences, not a withdrawal, but more like a processing, like a man who didn't see the point of saying things before he'd finished thinking them. When he finally spoke, he said, "Geller. He said a man named Geller sold cheap." "Yes. I know who bought that parcel. Fellow named Crane. He lives in Billings. I've seen him in Harlow Creek twice in the last year. He's been buying up Eastern Valley land." Abigail thought about that. The cold was sharper now, coming down off the ridgeline, and she was holding herself slightly forward off the saddle to take the pressure off her left side. "Does Crane have connections to the county assessor's office?" "I don't know, but I know he has money, and men with money in county offices tend to find each other." "We need to know who filed the 1874 survey document," she said. "There will be a record at the assessor's office. Who submitted it? When? Who authorized its inclusion?" "How do I get that?" "You ask for it. You're a property owner with a legal interest in all documents affecting your land claim. They're required to show you." She paused. "Whether Whitmore will honor that is another matter, but if he refuses, the refusal itself is significant." Colton was quiet again. Then he said, "How long were you in Pittsburgh?" It was asked carefully, not probing, not strategic, just asked. "Most of my life," she said, "until about 8 months ago." "You said your father was a solicitor." "He was. He died 4 years ago." She kept her voice level. "I married after that." He didn't say anything. She could feel the question he wasn't asking, the shape of it, and she decided on her own terms how much to give. "It wasn't a good marriage," she said. "That's the short version." "All right. The long version isn't something I'm ready to give yet." "I didn't ask for it." She knew he hadn't. That was part of why she'd said that much. They rode the rest of the way without talking, and the mountains moved slowly past on the western horizon, white-capped now against the gray sky, and the grass bent in the wind, and Abigail kept her left side still and breathed carefully and thought about a man named Crane in Billings who was buying up Eastern Valley land, and what kind of man he was, and who else had noticed. Back at the ranch, she spread everything on the kitchen table again. Pratt's statement, the original deed and survey, the fraudulent notice, and a piece of paper where she began writing a timeline. Colton came in from the barn and looked at it. "You should eat something," he said. "I will." He went to the stove and reheated the beans from lunch without being asked, and brought 2 bowls to the table and moved the papers to one side to make room for them. She ate and wrote simultaneously, which she knew was probably irritating, but he didn't say anything about it. Darnell came in from the cold, stomping his boots on the mat, and looked at the table covered in papers, and at Abigail writing, and at the half-eaten bowls, and said, "What happened?" "Sit down," Colton said. "We'll tell you." Abigail looked up at Darnell. He was 20 years old, and he'd worked this ranch for 2 years, and he had the kind of earnest face that made you want to be honest with him without quite knowing why. "Do you know a man named Crane?" she asked. "From Billings." Darnell sat down. "Heavy man? Gray coat? Comes through on the second Tuesday of the month sometimes?" "I don't know what he looks like." "I've seen him at the feed store twice. He buys in bulk and ships east. Theo at the feed store doesn't like him. Said he talked down to him." Darnell shrugged. "That's all I know." "Ships east," Abigail said. She wrote it down. "What's east of the Eastern Valley?" "The rail line," Colton said slowly. She looked at him. "There's a rail spur being discussed," he said, and something was shifting in his voice, pieces connecting. "I heard about it in town 2 months ago. A spur off the main Northern Pacific line that would run down through the Eastern Valley to service the mining interests up near the pass." Abigail set her pen down. "Land along a rail spur route," she said, "would be worth—" He stopped. "Considerably more than grazing land," she said. "If you could acquire it cheaply before the route was confirmed, through manufactured disputes that force ranchers to sell or simply transfer disputed land into administrative hold where it can be quietly reassigned." The kitchen was very quiet. Darnell said, "That's—" "Yes," Abigail said. "So Whitmore's not working alone," Colton said. "He's not working alone, and this isn't just about your 40 acres. It's a coordinated land scheme tied to railroad speculation. Whitmore handles the county paperwork. Crane, or whoever Crane works for, acquires the land through fronts. The railroad contract gets awarded, The land along the route doubles or triples in value, and the men who manufactured all of it collect. Colton sat back in his chair. He looked tired in a way that went past the day's ride. How many ranches? At minimum 3 that I know of from what Pratt told us. Probably more. Heck, Colton said. Heck was standing in the kitchen doorway, had been for the last few minutes. The Aldermans, Fosters. Who else has had county surveyors on their land this year? Heck scratched his jaw. The Morrison place, late summer, and I heard something about the Kincaid brothers, but I don't know the details. Abigail started writing names. The list was already longer than a personal land dispute. We need more than Pratt's statement, she said. For the October 14th hearing, Pratt's statement addresses your specific parcel and breaks the fraudulent survey. That's enough to get the commission to pause the action against you, if they're honest, or to expose them if they're not. She looked at Colton. But if we want to actually end this, stop it from happening to the next rancher after you, we need to take it to someone outside the county, the territorial government, or federal land office. A pattern of fraudulent survey filings across multiple ranches in the same county, all connected to land adjacent to a speculated rail route. That's not a county matter. That's a federal land fraud case. Darnell said, they'd send an investigator? If the documentation is right, Abigail said, if the filing is made correctly and the evidence is organized in the right way. She paused. I know how to do that. Colton looked at her. Something in the way he was looking at her had shifted since this morning. Not suddenly, more like the gradual adjustment of something long in place, finding a better angle. I know, he said. I've noticed that about you. She wasn't sure what to do with that exactly, so she looked back at her paper. We have 9 days. That's enough time to get statements from the other ranchers if someone starts writing tomorrow. I'll go, Darnell said immediately. You'll need to know what to ask them, Abigail said. She tore a piece of paper and started writing. I'll make you a list of the specific questions. What year the county surveyors came. Whether they received written notice before or after. Whether the survey document was ever shown to them or just filed without their knowledge. Whether they were approached afterward to sell. Darnell took the pen she held out and looked at the list she was starting to construct. I can remember this, he said. Write it down anyway. Yes, ma'am. Heck, from the doorway, made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. The letter arrived on the 8th day. It came with the week's post, which Colton picked up in town and brought back in his coat pocket without stopping to sort, and Abigail found it on the table when she came in from hanging laundry. A cold and miserable task, the sheets stiff in the air before she'd even gotten the second pin on, but she'd done it anyway because there was satisfaction in the ordinary stubbornness of keeping a household running. The envelope had a Pittsburgh return address. She stood at the table and looked at it for a long time. Harmon and Associates, the law firm. Gerald Harmon, her late husband's older brother, who had spent 8 months trying to find her and who, when he found her, would bring with him every resource and connection that came with being one of the oldest established families in western Pennsylvania. She knew why they'd found her. She'd been careful. She'd used her maiden name. She'd routed correspondence through the matrimonial agency's Chicago office. She'd told no one where she was going. But the Harmons had money, and money bought patience, and patience eventually found things. What she didn't know was what the letter said. She was still standing there when Colton came back in from the barn. He looked at her, then at the envelope. Something wrong? She handed it to him without speaking. He read the return address. Who's Harmon? My husband's family, she said. My late husband. He turned the envelope over. You haven't opened it. I haven't decided if I want to know what's in it yet. He set it back on the table. He didn't tell her to open it, didn't tell her it couldn't be that bad, didn't offer any of the things people offered when they wanted to manage someone else's fear into something more convenient. He just said, I'll be outside if you need me. And he went back out. She opened the letter. It was written by a lawyer, not by Gerald himself, which meant it was formal and precise and twice as threatening for it. The letter stated that the Harmon family had reason to believe that Abigail Harmon, formerly Turner, had provided a false account of the circumstances surrounding the death of her husband, William Harmon, in January of this year. It stated that new witnesses had come forward. It stated that the family intended to pursue the matter in civil court and was prepared to contact Montana territorial authorities if necessary. It requested her return to Pittsburgh to address these allegations. It did not say please. She folded the letter, put it in her apron pocket, went to the window and looked out at the yard, where Colton was splitting firewood. He swung the axe in the efficient, unhurried way he did most things, and the wood split clean, and he set the pieces aside and picked up the next log. She stood there and thought about William Harmond, which was something she did as little as possible. She thought about the staircase in the house on Merchant Street in Pittsburgh, the one with the turned banister she'd grabbed for and missed, and the bottom of those stairs, which she'd woken up on with her left side feeling like it had been reconstructed wrong. She thought about the men who'd come to the hospital and asked her questions and left looking satisfied. She thought about Gerald Harmon's face at the funeral, the particular way he'd looked at her. Not grief, not even accusation, something colder and more calculating than either. She thought about what new witnesses meant and who they might be and what they might say. Then she went outside. Colton saw her coming and set the axe down. She handed him the letter. He read it standing there in the cold with the woodpile at his back and his breath fogging in the air. He read it twice, which she recognized as his habit with documents he was taking seriously. Then he looked at her. "Is this—" He stopped, chose words carefully. "Is this something that can be answered?" "Yes," she said, "not the way they want it answered. The circumstances they're referring to." "My husband fell down the stairs," she said. "That is what happened. He had been drinking and he was angry and I was at the top of the stairs and he fell. That is what happened." She said it flat and clear, the way she'd said it to the police and to the hospital and to Gerald Harmon's lawyer in Pittsburgh, and the way she'd never said it to anyone who had believed her. Colton looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "You don't know me well enough to take that on faith." "No," he agreed. "But I know you well enough to know you're not telling me a practice story. There's a difference." He folded the letter and held it out to her. "What do they actually want?" She took the letter. "The land. William left me property. The house and a parcel of farmland outside the city. His family expected to inherit. The will said otherwise." She looked at the letter in her hands. "If they can establish wrongdoing, the inheritance is voided and the estate reverts. So this is about money. Everything with the Harmons is about money. And they have enough reach to get territorial authorities involved. Gerald Harmon has reach everywhere he puts his hand. He spent 30 years building it." She looked up. "Coming here was not accidental on my part. I needed distance. I needed a legal change of circumstance. I needed—" She stopped. "I didn't know about your land dispute when I came here. That was not calculated. I know that. But I want you to understand that I am not without complications. The Harmons will come, or they'll send someone. It's only a question of when." The wind moved through the yard, stirring the loose straw near the barn doors. A cow lowed somewhere in the back pen. Colton picked up the axe and set another log on the block. "We've got a hearing in 3 days," he said. "Let's get through that first." She watched him split the log. Both halves fell clean. "And after?" she said. He picked up the halves and stacked them. "After, we figure out the rest." He looked at her over his shoulder. "You said the inheritance, it's legally yours under the will?" "Yes. And the will was properly witnessed and filed." "My father drafted it." "Yes." "Then they don't have a case unless they can manufacture one." He turned to face her fully. "You know something about manufactured cases." She did. She knew exactly what they cost and what they looked like from the inside, and what it took to fight them. She'd been fighting one alone for 8 months. She looked at this man, this imperfect, careful, broken-nosed man who'd told her in a letter that he wasn't the kind of person who held people to things they didn't want, and who had so far kept that promise in every small way. And she felt something she didn't have an immediate name for. Not safety, not yet. But the thing adjacent to safety. The thing that made safety seem possible. "Yes," she said, "I do know something about that." He nodded once. "Then we have work to do." She pulled her coat tighter against the wind and went back inside to the table full of papers and the 9 years of her father's legal education that lived in her memory, and she got back to work. The night before the hearing, Abigail couldn't sleep. She lay on her back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around her. The tick of cooling wood, the wind off the mountains finding every small gap in the east wall, the distant sound of cattle shifting in the pen. Normal sounds. Ordinary sounds. The kind of sounds that meant nothing was wrong yet. Yet. She got up at 2:30 and went to the kitchen and built the fire back up and put the kettle on. She sat at the table with the documents spread in front of her and read through everything one more time, not because she needed to, but because the act of reading steadied her in a way that nothing else did. Her father had been like that too. When he was worried, he read. He'd told her once that the words on the page were the only thing that stayed exactly the same, no matter how many times you looked at them, and that there was comfort in that when everything else kept shifting. She was halfway through Pratt's statement when she heard the floorboards in the hall. Colton appeared in the kitchen doorway in his work clothes, his hair still flat on one side from the pillow. He looked at the fire and the kettle and the papers, and her sitting in the middle of it all, and didn't look particularly surprised. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "No." He came in and took the chair across from her. "Me either." She poured 2 cups when the kettle came up and pushed one across the table to him. He wrapped his hands around it and looked at the documents. "How does it look?" he said. "The land case is strong. Pratt's statement is solid, the elevation discrepancy is documented, and Darnell got statements from the Morrison and Kincaid ranchers." She set down the page she'd been holding. "What I don't know is how many of the commissioners Whitmore has in his pocket. If it's a majority, it doesn't matter how strong the case is. Judge Haverford runs the commission." What kind of man is he? Colton thought about it with the unhurried honesty she'd come to recognize as just the way he thought. "Vain," he said finally. "Cares a lot about how he looks. He's not crooked by nature, I don't think. But he's weak, and weak men in the company of crooked men tend to go whichever way is easier. So if Whitmore's case looks certain, Haverford goes with it. If ours looks stronger, he'll want to be on the right side of it." He looked at her. "You can make ours look stronger. I can make ours actually be stronger, whether that reads correctly in a room where half the people don't want to see it." She stopped, drank her coffee. "I've been in rooms like that before." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Harmon letter. Have you thought more about it?" "Constantly." "Is there anything in what they're claiming that could hurt the land case tomorrow? If they've already contacted territorial authorities?" "They haven't yet. The letter said prepared to contact, not that they had." She folded her hands around the cup. "They want me to come back to Pittsburgh voluntarily. They believe that's easier than a territorial proceeding. They're probably right." "Are you going back?" She looked at him. "No." He nodded, accepting this without editorializing. "But they'll come here," she said, "or they'll send someone. And when they do, they'll use everything they have. The allegations about William's death, whatever witnesses they've manufactured, and—" She stopped. "And what?" She set down her cup. This was the part she'd been deciding about for 4 days, weighing it at the kitchen table and on the ride to Pratt's, and in the dark at 2 a.m, and she'd arrived at the same place each time, which meant it was probably the right place. "There are things I haven't told you," she said, "about my marriage and about what happened before I left Pittsburgh. I've been waiting until I trusted you enough, but—" She looked at the window. Outside was still full dark, the mountains invisible, just black on black. "The hearing is in 7 hours, and if things go wrong today, or if someone from the Harmon family arrives before we've resolved anything, you'll be put in a position of defending a woman you don't know the whole truth about. That's not fair to you." The kitchen was quiet except for the fire. "You don't owe me anything," Colton said. "I told you that in the letter." "I know what you told me. I'm telling you anyway." She looked at him directly. "Because it's the right thing to do. Not because you asked." He didn't say anything. He just sat with his coffee and waited. And that simple act of waiting, not pushing, not filling the space, just being present and patient, was such an unfamiliar thing that she had to take a breath before she could start. She told it the way it actually happened, not the shaped version she'd given the police, or the edited version she'd given her sister, or the bare minimum she'd given the matrimonial agency in Chicago. She told it the way it was. She had married William Harmon 5 years ago, 6 months after her father died, At a moment when she'd been alone and frightened and William had seemed like stability. He had seemed, for about 4 months, like the thing she needed. Then the drinking got worse. Then the anger behind the drinking got worse. And then the line crossed, that lines always eventually cross, and she'd spent the next 2 years in a marriage that she'd been too ashamed and too frightened and too isolated to leave. His family knew, she said. Not the details, maybe, but they knew he drank and they knew his temper, and they said nothing because he was the younger Harmon brother and the Harmons didn't air things in public. She kept her voice level. I tried to leave once, in the 2nd year. Gerald Harmon came to my sister's house personally and explained very quietly that if I pursued a legal separation, he would ensure that my father's reputation, his professional reputation, his legacy, was destroyed. Something about a case he'd been involved in, improper conduct, things that weren't true. But Gerald was friends with the right people, and the right people could make untrue things look very convincing. Colton's jaw was tight. He didn't interrupt. So I stayed, she said, and I learned to manage it. I learned the patterns, when he was more dangerous and when he was less, what to do and what to avoid. I got good at it the way you get good at things you have to survive. She looked at her hands. In January, it was a bad night. He'd been drinking since the afternoon, and there was something that set him off. I don't even remember what now. Something small and stupid. He came up the stairs after me. She stopped. The fire popped. I was at the top of the staircase, she said. He grabbed my arm. I pulled away. He lost his balance. She said it very carefully, each word placed. He fell down the stairs, 14 steps. He hit the bottom, and he didn't move, and I stood there for a long time before I went down to him. She looked up. He was dead. He'd broken his neck in the fall. Colton didn't say anything. I called for the neighbor. I told the police what happened. Exactly what I told you. He lost his balance and fell. Because that is what happened. She felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with saying it. The specific exhaustion of having told a true thing and having it read as a convenient thing. But Gerald had already decided what the story was going to be. And his lawyer was better than the police detective, and the detective was lazy, and William was dead. And dead men's families have a great deal of influence over what questions get asked. What story did Gerald put forward? That I pushed him. The fire crackled. Wind against the window. And the witnesses they mentioned in the letter? Will be people Gerald paid, she said flatly, or people he has leverage over. The Harmons have spent 300 years in Pittsburgh accumulating leverage. She looked at him. I don't know who they found or what they'll say. I only know that whatever they say won't be true. Colton set down his cup. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment, and she watched him and felt the particular taut stillness of waiting for a verdict. He looked up. Do you have anything from that time? He said. Documentation. A doctor. Anyone who saw what your marriage actually was. She blinked. It wasn't what she'd expected him to say. There was a doctor, she said slowly. After the staircase incident in February, the month before William died. My ribs. She touched her left side without thinking, then stopped. He saw me at the hospital. He wrote it up as a fall because that's what I told him to write, because at that point I was still trying to protect myself from Gerald's reaction if the truth came out. But the record exists. Can you get it? I'd need to contact the hospital in Pittsburgh, or my sister. She might have access to it. She paused. Why? Because if the Harmons bring a civil case here, or pressure territorial authorities, you need counter-documentation, not just your word. He said it practically, the way he said most things. Your word is enough for me. It's not enough for a judge. She sat with that for a moment. The directness of it. The way he had moved, without drama or declaration, from here is a terrible thing you've told me directly to here is what we do about it. No performance of sympathy. No recalibration of how he looked at her. Just the next step. My ribs, she said. You knew. He looked at her. I noticed you favoring your left side the first day. The way you get up from chairs. The way you held yourself on the horse. You didn't say anything. You didn't want me to. That was true. She had not wanted him to, and he had read that correctly and respected it without being asked. She thought about how ordinary that should be and how far from ordinary it had felt when it happened. "They're mostly healed now," she said. "I know. You move easier than you did 2 weeks ago." She almost laughed, not from humor, but from something less nameable, the strange sensation of being accurately observed by someone with no agenda in the observation. "All right," she said. "The hospital records. I'll write to my sister tomorrow, after the hearing." She picked up her pen. "Right now I need to write out the order of argument for the morning. I want to present Pratt's statement before the commissioners ask to see our deed. Because if we lead with the deed, they'll challenge it immediately, and we lose the room before we've established the fraud. We need to establish the fraud first." Colton straightened up and looked at the papers. "What do you need me to do?" "Tell me everything you know about each commissioner, names, connections, who they owe favors to." He pulled his chair around to her side of the table, and they worked until the sky outside the window went from black to gray. The Harlow Creek County Commission met in a room above the feed store, which shared the building with the land recorder's office and a small room used variously as a courtroom and a storage space depending on the week. The commission room had 6 chairs for commissioners, a table for presenting parties, and benches along the wall for observers. By the time Abigail and Colton arrived at 9:30, the benches were full. She hadn't expected that. Word had moved through the valley faster than she'd anticipated. The Morrison family was there, 3 of them, the father and 2 grown sons. The Kincaid brothers, who she'd never met, stood against the back wall in matching canvas coats. There were other faces she didn't know, ranchers and their wives, and a few townspeople who'd come because it was the most interesting thing happening in Harlow Creek on a Tuesday in October. Heck was near the door. He caught her eye and gave her a single nod. Darnell was supposed to be outside. She found out why when Colton touched her elbow and said quietly, "There's someone here." She looked where he was looking, at the front bench on the right side of the room. 2 men she didn't know. Suits too good for Montana, boots without a scratch of field dirt on them. City men. One was young and sharp-looking with a leather briefcase. The other was older, heavy through the shoulders, with the particular settled quality of a man who went where money sent him. "Do you know them?" Colton said. "No, but I know what they are." The young one looked up and saw her looking and didn't look away, which answered the question of whether they were here for the land hearing or for something else. "Don't change anything," she said to Colton. "We run the same case." "Abigail, nothing changes," she said, and she walked to the presenting table and set down her papers. Judge Haverford was exactly what Colton had described, a large man in a too-good waistcoat who took his seat at the center of the commissioner's table with the deliberateness of someone performing authority. He was perhaps 60, with side whiskers going white and the reddened complexion of a man who ate and drank well and intended to keep doing so. He looked at Abigail when she sat at the presenting table and his eyebrows moved fractionally. Not offense exactly, but recalculation. He hadn't expected her to be there. Whitmore sat at the other table. He was a smaller man than she'd imagined, narrow-faced, with pale eyes, and the specific kind of stillness that came from being certain of outcomes in advance. He glanced at her once and then looked away, which she noted. The 2 suited men had not moved from their bench. Haverford called the hearing to order with a considerable amount of procedural formality that accomplished very little except to establish his own importance, and then asked Whitmore to present the county's position. Whitmore presented it smoothly. The 1874 survey, the discrepancy, the need to establish the correct boundary before further development proceeded. He used a lot of words like administrative necessity and regulatory obligation and orderly process, and he presented a copy of the fraudulent survey as if it were as natural as a deed of sale. 2 of the 6 commissioners were nodding before he'd finished the first page. Abigail watched their faces. She counted. 4 of the 6 were looking at Whitmore with the particular attentiveness of men who already knew which way they were going to vote. Haverford was looking at his own hands. When Whitmore finished, Haverford looked at Colton. "Mr. Briggs, you wish to present a counterposition." Colton looked at Abigail. She stood up. One of the commissioners, a thin man named Farley, whom Colton had identified as Whitmore's closest ally on the panel, said, "Who is this woman?" "My name is Abigail Turner Briggs," she said, using the name for the first time in that configuration, and heard Colton make no sound at all beside her. I manage the legal and financial records of this property, and I'm presenting the counter evidence on behalf of the property owner. She didn't ask permission. She just said it as a fact and moved forward before anyone had time to formulate an objection. I'd like to begin with the original survey of the Briggs land claim, conducted in the spring of 1873 by licensed surveyor Josiah Pratt. She put the document on the table and turned it to face the commissioners. The eastern ridge marker, she said, is recorded at 4,180 feet above sea level. This is a geological fixed point. It does not change between surveys. She put Whitmore's document beside it. The 1874 survey, presented by Commissioner Whitmore, records the same point at 4,240 feet, a difference of 60 feet on a fixed geological marker. Silence. I also have a sworn statement from Josiah Pratt himself, obtained 6 days ago, in which he attests that the 1874 survey document does not match his measurements, does not match his professional notation practices, and that he received no notice and conducted no resurvey of this property in 1874. She put the statement on top. Haverford leaned forward slightly. Farley said, "A surveyor's memory of a job done years ago." "A surveyor's professional records," Abigail said. "Mr. Pratt maintains full documentation of every survey he's conducted in this territory. His original field notes from the 1873 survey, with measured elevations, are attached." She produced the field notes. He was good enough to include them. Whitmore had gone very still. She went to the next item. "I've also obtained statements from 2 neighboring property owners, the Morrison Ranch and the Kincaid property, who experienced identical survey dispute notices in the past 18 months. In each case, the disputed parcels sit adjacent to land that has subsequently been acquired by third parties. In each case, the acquiring party is traceable to the same brokerage operation in Billings." She heard movement on the observer's bench. She didn't look. "This commission is being asked to authorize the transfer of productive grazing land based on a survey document that contains demonstrable errors, was filed without the knowledge or consent of the property owner, and follows a pattern consistent with coordinated land fraud across multiple parcels in this county." The room was very quiet. Haverford looked at Whitmore. Whitmore said, "These are serious allegations, Judge, and the source is documented evidence," Abigail said. Not loud, just clear. "If Commissioner Whitmore can explain the 60-foot elevation discrepancy, I'd be interested to hear it." Whitmore's pale eyes moved to her. "I'm not required to answer to what?" she said. "To someone asking about your paperwork?" Farley cleared his throat. "Judge, I'd suggest," said a new voice from the back of the room, "that you let her finish." She turned. The older of the 2 suited men had stood up. He was holding out a card toward the room in general, the specific gesture of a man accustomed to a card being sufficient identification. "My name is Amos Teller," he said. "I'm a land fraud investigator for the Federal General Land Office. We've been monitoring land transaction irregularities in the eastern Valley counties for the past 4 months." He walked forward slowly, as if he had all the time available to him. "Commissioner Whitmore, I believe we've been trying to reach you." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room where everyone has suddenly reassessed their position. Whitmore stood up. "I need to," he started. "Please sit down," Teller said pleasantly. "We're not done here." It did not resolve that morning. Nothing like this resolved in a single morning, and Abigail had known that before she walked in. What happened instead was a controlled unraveling. Whitmore's smooth certainty developed cracks. Haverford pivoted publicly to the side of procedural caution in a way that was transparent and self-serving but useful, and Teller's young colleague took quiet notes in the corner and occasionally asked commissioners to repeat things. The action against the Briggs property was suspended pending federal review. It was not a victory. It was a pause. But a pause was a great deal better than what they'd walked in facing. They were outside on the street afterward, her and Colton and Heck and the Morrisons and the Kincaid brothers, who turned out to be in their 60s and furious and grateful simultaneously, when Teller came out and walked directly to Abigail. "That was organized work," he said. "Who put together the filing documentation?" "I did," she said. He looked at her with the assessing expression of a professional encountering competence from an unexpected direction. "Were you trained in law?" "My father was a solicitor. I worked with him from the age of 12. He pulled out a card. The federal review will take some time. There are broader implications here. The railroad land scheme, as you outlined it, has tentacles we've been trying to map for 2 years. He held out the card. If you're willing to consult on the documentation framework, I'd be interested in talking to you formally. There's compensation for that kind of work. She took the card. She looked at it. I'll think about it, she said. He nodded and went back inside. Colton was beside her. She could feel him without looking. The particular quality of his presence, solid and undemonstrative, not touching her but there. Consulting work for the Federal Land Office, he said. I said I'd think about it. I know. A pause. You called yourself Abigail Turner Briggs in there. She looked at the card in her hand. She hadn't planned it. The name had come out because it was the one that placed her. The one that said, this person belongs somewhere in a room full of people ready to question her right to be there. I needed to establish standing, she said. I know. It wasn't... She stopped, started again. I didn't mean to overstep. You didn't. He was quiet for a moment. I thought it sounded right. She didn't say anything. Out on the street, Darnell was talking to the younger Kincaid brother and using his hands to describe something that had apparently impressed him. Mrs. Morrison, a broad-faced woman in a good wool coat, caught Abigail's eye and nodded once. A rancher's nod, plain and direct, the kind that meant thank you without making a production of it. Abigail nodded back. Her left side ached from 2 hours of standing and the tension of performing certainty she'd only half felt, and there was still the matter of the Harmond letter, still the 2 men from Pittsburgh who'd been on that bench, because she'd been so focused on Teller that she hadn't figured out yet who the second suited man was, and that was an oversight she was already irritated at herself for. She turned to look for him, scanning the street. He was gone. The second man, she said to Colton. Did you see where he went? Colton looked at the street. He left during Teller's presentation. She stood very still for a moment. He wasn't with Teller, she said. No, Colton said slowly. He came in with him, but they didn't speak to each other after. He looked at her. Could be coincidence. Could be, she said. Neither of them believed it. She put Teller's card in her coat pocket and stood on the main street of Harlow Creek, Montana, with the cold October wind moving down from the mountains, and thought about the Harmon family's reach, and a man with city shoes and a leather briefcase who had been in that room and then disappeared, and felt the brief warmth of the morning's partial victory cool and harden into something more like readiness. They had taken a step. The ground ahead was still uncertain, but she was still standing on it. That, she had learned over the years, was not a small thing. The man from the hearing showed up at the ranch 2 days later. Abigail was in the kitchen when she heard the horse, and she went to the window and looked out and saw him coming up the track. The second suited man, the one who'd disappeared during Teller's presentation. He rode a good horse badly, posting too high in the saddle, and his coat was the kind of heavy wool that said Eastern City even from 100 yards out. She stepped back from the window. Colton was already at the door. He'd heard the horse too. She'd noticed that about him, the way his attention registered things before he appeared to be paying attention to them. A habit of watchfulness that probably came from years of running a property alone. I know him, she said. Colton turned. Not personally, but the coat is Harmon family money. Gerald sends lawyers the way other men send letters. She looked at the rider coming up the track. He was in that hearing to assess what I have. Now he knows. What do you want to do? She thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Let him come in. I want to hear what they're offering. Colton looked at her. They're always offering something first, she said. That's how Gerald operates. The threat comes after the offer, if the offer doesn't work. If I know what they want badly enough to offer for, I know how worried they are. He considered this. All right. He opened the door and waited on the porch while the lawyer, because that was what he was, she was certain of it, tied his horse at the post and walked up. He was younger than she'd thought in the hearing room, maybe 30, with a clean-shaved face and the particular posture of a man trained to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. Mr. Briggs, he said. Then he looked at Abigail in the doorway behind Colton. Mrs. Harmond. Miss Turner, she said. Come in. Bamuts. His name was Prescott. He accepted coffee and sat at the kitchen table and put his briefcase on the floor beside his chair and didn't open it, which told her something. He wasn't here to present documents yet. This was a conversation first. Heck was somewhere on the property. Darnell was in town. She thought briefly about sending for one of them and then decided against it. She didn't want witnesses to whatever offer Prescott was about to make, because offers were best negotiated without an audience measuring your reaction. Colton sat at the end of the table and said nothing, which was exactly right. Prescott wrapped his hands around the coffee cup and looked at her with the expression of a man performing reasonableness. "I'll be direct," he said. "Please, the Harmon family is prepared to withdraw all allegations relating to the circumstances of William Harmon's death. The civil matter, the communication with territorial authorities, all of it. Completely and formally withdrawn." She waited. "In exchange," he said, "for a quitclaim on the Merchant Street property and the rural parcel outside the city, the house and the farmland, William's estate, the things she'd legally inherited and that Gerald had spent 8 months trying to get back." She looked at him steadily. "And the allegations themselves would not be pursued." "That's not what I asked. The allegations would be withdrawn, you said. What happens to the witnesses Gerald has already spoken to? The people prepared to say I pushed my husband down a flight of stairs?" Prescott's expression adjusted slightly. "Those individuals would be released from any obligation to provide testimony. Paid witnesses, then. As she'd thought, men and women who had signed nothing permanent, who could be unsigned just as easily. "So what you're telling me," she said, "is that the entire case against me was manufactured, that the witnesses are people Gerald controls, and that the price of making it go away is the inheritance my husband legally left me." "I wouldn't characterize it." "I know how you'd characterize it." She set her cup down. "What I want to understand is why now. Gerald has had 8 months to pursue this. Why come to Montana in October?" Prescott glanced at his briefcase. "The hearing," she said. "He heard about the hearing." Prescott said nothing, which was the same as confirming it. She looked at Colton. He was watching Prescott with the flat attention he gave things he'd already decided about. She looked back at the lawyer. "Gerald is concerned that if I can organize a land fraud case against a county commissioner with federal implications, I can also organize a defense against his allegations. He wants this settled before I have time to get the hospital records from Pittsburgh." Prescott's face did something small and controlled. "There are hospital records," she said, "from February of last year. My injuries are documented. The attending physician's notes are in the hospital's files, and while I told him it was a fall, the nature of the injuries and the notation about my presentation that day are informative." She paused. "My father taught me that documentation is the only thing that survives long enough to matter. He was right. I've been right about a great many things my late husband's family preferred I be wrong about." The kitchen was very quiet. Prescott said carefully, "The family's position, tell Gerald," she said, "that his position is not as strong as he thought it was in September. Tell him that I'm not the woman who sat in a root cellar in Pennsylvania eating dried apples because I had nowhere else to go. Tell him that if he wants to send a formal legal communication, he can address it to me here at this property, and I will respond through proper channels." She stood up. "And tell him that if he sends anyone else to this ranch without prior formal notice, I will consider it harassment and file accordingly with the territorial marshal's office." Prescott looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his briefcase and stood. "I'll convey your response," he said. "I know you will." Colton walked him to the door without speaking. Abigail heard the horse leave, the hoofbeats going down the track and fading into the general sound of wind and distance. She sat back down. Her hands were not shaking. She checked, because they sometimes did after things like this, and they were steady, which she took as a sign that she'd crossed some threshold she hadn't noticed crossing. Colton came back in. "Hospital records," he said. "I wrote to my sister 3 days ago. I didn't tell you because I didn't know if she'd respond, and I didn't want to. I didn't want to say I had something before I knew I had it. But you think she'll send them?" "Clara is the only member of my family who was honest with me about what my marriage looked like from the outside. She didn't help me leave. She was too frightened of the Harmons for that. But she watched. She saw things." She looked at her hands on the table. "She'll send them." Colton sat down. He was quiet for a moment, and she waited for the question that was probably forming, The reasonable question about what she intended to do with the records, whether she was planning to file something, what the legal strategy was. And instead he said, "Are you all right?" She looked up. That was... He gestured vaguely at the door Prescott had gone out of. That kind of thing takes something out of you, even when it goes well. She considered denying it. Then she said, "Yes, it does." "Then eat something. It's past noon." She almost laughed. It came out more like an exhale than a laugh, but it was close. He got up and went to the stove and started heating what was left of the morning soup, and she sat at the table with the particular exhaustion of a woman who had been braced for a fight and had held her ground and hadn't yet had time to unclench. Teller came back to Harlow Creek the following week. He came with his young colleague and 2 additional men she didn't know, and they set up in the room above the feed store. The same commission room, different configuration, commissioners conspicuously absent, and asked Abigail and Colton to come in for a formal interview. The investigation, Teller explained, had expanded. The railroad speculation scheme was larger than the Eastern Valley. The brokerage in Billings that had been quietly acquiring disputed land was connected to a land investment syndicate operating across 3 territories, and the county assessor's office in Harlow Creek was one of 5 county offices they'd identified with falsified survey filings. Whitmore was not the architect. He was, as Abigail had suspected, a functionary. The men above him were elsewhere, and Teller was working his way up. "The documentation you produced for the October 14th hearing," Teller said, looking at his notes, "gave us the clearest picture we've had of the filing mechanism. The notation discrepancy in the fraudulent survey matched similar discrepancies in 2 other counties. Same error pattern, same hand, possibly, or the same template. Someone made a standard fraudulent survey document and customized it per parcel," Abigail said. "That's our working theory, yes. Then the person who created the template is the key, not Whitmore. Find who made the original falsified document, and you find the top of the operation." Teller's young colleague looked up from his notes. "We'd already arrived at that conclusion," Teller said, with the slight dryness of a man conceding a point he'd have preferred to make himself. "I wanted your documentation framework for the other affected properties, the Morrison and Kincaid statements you obtained, the structure of those affidavits. We'd like you to help us build the same structure for the other ranches across the territory." Colton looked at her. She looked at Teller. "That's a significant amount of work." "It is. As I said, there's compensation." "I heard you. I'm not asking about compensation." She folded her hands on the table. "I'm asking whether the work will actually result in those ranches getting their land back, or whether this becomes a federal investigation that runs for 3 years while the families lose their winter grazing." Teller held her look. "We move faster when we have organized documentation, which is why I'm here." "Then you'll have it," she said. "But I want a formal written agreement on the scope of the consulting arrangement and a commitment from the land office that the suspended actions against the affected properties will not be activated during the investigation period." The young colleague stopped writing and looked at Teller. Teller said, "You understand I don't have personal authority to commit to. Then get it from someone who does." She said it without particular heat, just matter-of-factly. "These ranchers can't run their operations under a suspended cloud indefinitely. They need certainty. If you want the documentation, get the commitment." Teller sat back and studied her with an expression that had moved past surprise into something more like professional evaluation. "Where did you learn to negotiate?" "My father. And 3 years of marriage to a man whose family had lawyers for everything." She paused. "You learn quickly, or you don't?" The commitment came back in writing within 4 days, which told her that the federal office wanted this investigation resolved more urgently than Teller had let on. She signed the consulting agreement and started building case files. It was the kind of work she could do well, and she knew it. Organizing evidence into a structure that told a clear story, anticipating the challenges, building each argument so that the one after it had somewhere to stand. She worked at the kitchen table, and sometimes Colton sat across from her doing his own account books, and sometimes Heck came in for coffee and sat in the corner and occasionally said something useful about a neighboring rancher's land history that she wrote down, and sometimes Darnell came in and was sent out again because he kept asking questions at the wrong moments, and the ranch ran around her in its ordinary rhythms while she built something that she thought might actually hold. It was on the 9th day of this that the second complication arrived. Not Prescott this time. Two men, but these weren't lawyers. They were older and harder looking, in working clothes that were too new, and they rode up to the ranch in the mid-morning and asked for Colton and stood in the yard with the specific loose-limbed patience of men who'd been told to wait and were comfortable with waiting. Heck came to find her. "Don't know them," he said quietly. "But the big one's got a Pennsylvania accent. I noticed when he spoke." She put down her pen. She went to the window first before going outside, looked at the two men. The larger one was standing with his thumbs in his belt and looking at the barn with no particular urgency, and there was something about his build and the way he carried himself that she recognized as a type rather than a specific person. The kind of man Gerald Harmon hired when he was done with lawyers. "Where's Colton?" she said. "East fence. I can get him." "Go." She stood at the window for another moment. Then she straightened her dress, picked up the legal pad she'd been writing on, not because she needed it, but because having something in her hands helped her think, and went outside. The larger man turned when she came out. The younger one, who was perhaps 25 and had the kind of face that hadn't yet learned to conceal what it was thinking, looked at her with visible surprise, as if he'd expected someone smaller. "I'm Abigail Turner Briggs," she said. She used both names without thinking about it anymore. "You're looking for Mr. Briggs. He'll be here shortly. Can I ask your business?" The larger man, he had a broad red face and pale eyes, and he was perhaps 50, not fat but thick, looked at her with the expression of a man reassessing a situation. "We're here about a property matter," he said. "Which property?" "The Harmon estate. In Pittsburgh." She kept her face still. "And you are?" "Associates of Mr. Gerald Harmon." "Associates," she said. "Not lawyers. We handle practical matters." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Heck." Heck appeared from the direction of the barn, which meant he'd never actually gone for Colton. He'd positioned himself. She noted this with a specific appreciation. "These men are here on behalf of the Harmon family," she said to Heck. "Could you make sure Darnell knows we have company?" Heck nodded and went. He'd be back in 2 minutes, and when he came back, he wouldn't be alone. The large man watched this without expression. "We're not here to cause trouble," he said. "Then what are you here for?" "To convey a message." Mr. Harmon felt the previous communication may not have been clear. It was perfectly clear. She looked at him directly. "Let me tell you what I believe, and you can convey this back. Gerald Harmon manufactured a legal case against me using paid witnesses. A lawyer named Prescott came here 10 days ago and offered to withdraw it in exchange for property that is legally mine. I declined. If Gerald's response to that declination is to send men to my home, men who describe themselves as handling practical matters, then he's made a miscalculation." The younger man glanced at his companion. "Because," Abigail continued, "I am currently engaged as a consulting partner to a federal land fraud investigation that has the full attention of the General Land Office, and by extension, the kind of federal oversight that takes a dim view of intimidation against witnesses and affiliated parties." She let that land. "And because the Territorial Marshal's office in Billings is aware of my situation, at my request, as of 6 days ago." That last part wasn't entirely true. She had written the letter. She didn't know yet if it had been received, but they didn't know that. Colton came around the corner of the barn. He'd been running, she could tell, but he'd slowed to a walk before they could see him do it, and he came across the yard with the unhurried authority of a man on his own land. Heck and Darnell were behind him. The large man looked at Colton, then at Abigail, then back at the situation in general, and she watched him run the calculation. 2 men behind Briggs, one of them a kid, but the other an old hand who'd clearly done this kind of arithmetic before. A federal investigation, a territorial marshal's letter, and a woman who hadn't flinched once. "I'll convey your message," he said. Same words Prescott had used, different tone. "Please do," she said. They left. She watched them go down the track, and Colton came to stand beside her, and neither of them said anything until the horses were out of sight. Then Darnell said, "What just happened?" "Gerald Harmon ran out of lawyers," Abigail said, "so he tried something else." "Is that good or bad?" "It means he's more worried than Prescott's visit suggested." She turned and went back inside. It means the hospital records are more important than ever, and it means we don't have as much time as I thought. Clara's letter arrived 4 days after that. It came in a thick envelope, heavier than a letter should be, and Abigail knew before she opened it. She sat at the kitchen table in the early morning, before anyone else was up, and opened it carefully. Clara had written 3 pages in her neat, slightly anxious hand, catching up, asking questions about Montana, about Colton, about whether Abigail was safe, the questions of a woman who'd been worried for a long time and was only now able to ask directly. Abigail read it twice. She would answer it tonight. Behind the letter were the documents. Clara had gone to the hospital herself, which had cost her something. The Harmons had connections to that hospital's board, and being seen pulling records could have consequences. She'd gotten them anyway. 7 pages of physician's notes, intake documentation, and a secondary assessment from a different doctor who'd examined her 2 weeks after the initial injury. Abigail read the intake notes. The attending physician had written, "Patient presents with 2 fractured ribs on the left side, bruising consistent with blunt force impact across the lateral thorax and left shoulder. Patient states injury resulted from a fall. Presentation and injury pattern are not fully consistent with a simple domestic fall. No further disclosure made by patient. Recommended follow-up." She sat with that for a while. Not fully consistent with a simple domestic fall. A doctor who had seen what he'd seen and written it down carefully and then let it rest because she'd told him to, because that was what she'd needed at the time. Now it was something else. She was still sitting there when Colton came in. He saw the letter, the documents, her face. "Clara came through," she said. He sat down across from her. She didn't hand him the documents. She told him what they said, which was enough. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That breaks their case. It significantly weakens it. A doctor's note saying my injuries weren't consistent with a simple fall, dated 2 months before William died. It contradicts the narrative they've built. It doesn't prove anything on its own, but combined with a formal declaration from me and a challenge to the credibility of their paid witnesses." She set the pages down. "Gerald counted on me being isolated and documented as nothing. He didn't count on a paper trail. What do you need to do with it? File a formal response to the Harmon allegations through the territorial court. Attach the medical documentation. Submit a counter-declaration." She looked up. "And I need to do it before Gerald escalates again. Those men he sent, they were a test. If I'd been frightened, he'd have sent something worse. Can tell her help, federally." She thought about it. The Harmon matter isn't his jurisdiction, but a federal investigator vouching for my standing as a reliable partner in an active federal case. She paused. "That's worth something in front of a territorial judge, yes." She started making a list. It was what she did when the path forward was complicated. She made a list of the steps, and the steps became manageable, and the manageable became done. Her father had called it eating the elephant 1 bite at a time, and she'd told him once that she found the metaphor unpleasant and he'd laughed for a long time. She missed him. She wrote the list. Colton made coffee. Outside, the October morning was clear and cold, and the mountains had a new inch of snow on them that hadn't been there yesterday, and the cattle were making their morning sounds in the pen, and Heck's boots could be heard on the porch boards. An ordinary morning. She was in it, in the middle of it, and she was not hidden, and she was not running, and she was not managing her breath against cracked ribs on a stagecoach going somewhere she didn't know. She was here. She had built something to stand on. She wrote the list, and then she got up and started breakfast, because the work went better when people had eaten, and there was a full day ahead, and every item on the list was something that could, actually, be done. The formal hearing before Territorial Judge Aldous Creer was scheduled for a Thursday in early November. And it was not the kind of proceeding where large crowds gathered, but Abigail had not expected one. This wasn't the commission room above the feed store with ranchers on the benches. This was a single room in the territorial courthouse in Billings, wood-paneled and smelling of old paper, with a clerk and a stenographer and a judge, who had been on the territorial bench for 11 years and had the kind of permanently unimpressed expression that came from seeing everything twice. Gerald had not come himself. He'd sent 2 lawyers, real ones this time, from a proper firm, and they sat at one table with a thick stack of files and the air of men who billed by the hour and found Montana inconvenient. Abigail sat at the other table with a single folder and teller's letter of professional support in her coat pocket, which she hadn't needed to use yet. Colton sat in the gallery. She'd told him he didn't need to come. He'd looked at her with the particular expression that meant he wasn't going to discuss it, and he'd come. Heck had stayed at the ranch. Darnell had wanted to come and had been voted down by both of them. The Harmon lawyers presented their case first. They did it competently, organized, factual, in the way that selected facts could be. The story of a woman who had been present at her husband's death and whose account had been questioned by people who had known William Harmon well. They named the witnesses, they presented affidavits. Abigail listened and took notes and did not show anything on her face. Then it was her turn. She stood up. She had thought about how to do this for 2 weeks. She had written out a full argument and then set it aside, because the written argument had the particular quality of something over-prepared, and over-prepared arguments in front of experienced judges often had the opposite of the intended effect. What she needed to do was simpler. "Your Honor," she said, "the Harmon family's position rests on the testimony of 3 witnesses who claim to have information about the circumstances of William Harmon's death. I'd like to begin by establishing something about those witnesses." She put the first document on the clerk's table. This is a financial record obtained through the territorial court's discovery process, showing payments made by Gerald Harmon's personal account to 2 of those 3 named witnesses in the 6 months following William Harmon's death. The amounts are not small. One of the Harmon lawyers straightened in his chair. "The 3rd witness," she continued, "is an employee of the Harmon family business, employed at Gerald Harmon's discretion, whose continued employment is therefore contingent on Gerald Harmon's goodwill." She put down the second document. "I am not saying these people are lying. I am saying that their testimony is not independent." She moved to the medical record. She put it on the clerk's table and looked at the judge, who was looking at it. "This is a physician's intake note from February of last year, 2 months before William Harmon's death. It documents injuries I sustained. The attending physician wrote in his own notes that the injury pattern was, and I'm quoting, not fully consistent with a simple domestic fall." She let that sit for a moment. "These are injuries I told the doctor resulted from a fall. I said that because I was frightened, because I was alone, and because the Harmon family's influence extended to that hospital's board, and I did not believe the truth would be received or protected." Creer was reading the document. "I am not asking this court to adjudicate my marriage or my husband's death," she said. "I'm asking this court to assess whether the Harmon family's allegations meet the standard of credible, independent evidence, and to weigh those allegations against documentation that tells a different story about what my marriage actually looked like and about who had reason to construct a narrative after William Harmon's death." She sat down. The room was quiet. The Harmon lawyers asked for a recess to review the documentation. Creer granted 10 minutes. She sat at the table and breathed carefully. Not because her ribs hurt. They didn't. Not really. Not the way they had 4 months ago. But because breathing carefully was still how she got through things, and she saw no reason to stop doing it now. Colton, in the gallery, said nothing. He just looked at her when she glanced back, and in his look was the plain thing, not approval, not admiration, just the steady presence of a person who was there. It was enough. It was, she had discovered, quite considerably enough. The recess ended. The Harmon lawyers requested a continuance. Creer denied it. He looked at both tables with his permanently unimpressed expression and said that in his assessment, the Harmon allegations lacked independent evidentiary support sufficient to warrant the territorial proceeding as originally presented, and that in light of the counter-documentation regarding the character of the marriage, the court was disinclined to accept the framing of events the Harmon family had constructed. The matter was dismissed without prejudice, which meant Gerald could theoretically try again, but would do so knowing the ground had already been examined. It was not a complete victory. It was a door closed. She gathered her papers slowly, making sure she had everything in the right order, because her hands wanted to do something and putting papers in order was something they could do. The Harmon lawyers were talking to each other in low voices at their table, and neither of them looked at her. Colton was at her shoulder when she turned around. "All right," he said. "Yes?" She looked at the closed courtroom door. "Gerald will review his options. He may try again differently, but it will cost him more than he thought and take longer than he planned. And in the meantime, the federal investigation will have run its course, and I will have been a documented cooperating partner in that investigation, which makes the optics of pursuing me considerably worse." She paused. "He's a practical man. Practical men assess costs." "So it's over." "It's considerably improved," she said carefully. "Over is a word I'll use when I'm sure of it." He looked at her for a moment. "That's a reasonable answer." "I thought so." They walked out of the courthouse into the November cold of Billings, and the sky was the particular pale blue of late autumn, and the street outside was full of ordinary people going about ordinary business, and Abigail Turner Briggs stood on the top step and breathed the cold air, and felt, running underneath the exhaustion and the caution and the accumulated weight of the past months, something small and persistent that she recognized after a moment as relief. Not the end, but the beginning of what came after. She went down the steps. Colton fell in beside her. They had a long drive back to Harlow Creek, and the Eastern Ridge was still under federal review, and there was a consulting file on her kitchen table that needed 2 more weeks of work, and Claire's letter was still waiting for a proper answer. She had a great deal to do. She found, walking toward the wagon on a cold November morning in Billings, Montana, that she didn't mind that at all. The drive back from Billings took 3 hours, and for most of it, neither of them said much. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the quality of the silence. It had changed from the silences of the past weeks, which had been dense with things not yet resolved, into something looser, not empty, just easier to sit inside of. Abigail watched the landscape move past and let herself feel the particular flatness that came after sustained tension, the way a muscle felt after it finally unclenched. Not good exactly, but honest. Colton drove. The horses knew the road home. About an hour out of Billings, he said, "Clara, your sister. Will you tell her how it went?" "Tonight," Abigail said. "She took a real risk getting those records. She needs to know it mattered." Will Gerald go after her for it?" She thought about it honestly. He might try to make her uncomfortable, but Clara's husband has his own connections, and Gerald's been losing ground steadily for 2 months. Practical men reassess. She looked at her hands in her lap. He'll move on to something easier. That's what men like Gerald do. They don't stop, they redirect. I'm no longer the easiest thing. That's not exactly comforting. No, she agreed, but it's accurate, and I prefer accurate. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. It was, she had learned over these weeks, as close to a laugh as he generally got, and she'd stopped waiting for something louder. The sun was dropping toward the western mountains when they came over the last ridge, and she could see the ranch below. The house, the barn, the fence lines running off into the grass, the smoke coming from the kitchen chimney that meant Heck had been in and built the fire up. It looked ordinary and impermanent the way everything looked from a distance. And then as they came down the track and the details resolved themselves, the particular lean of the gatepost, the patch on the barn door, the kitchen window with its slightly uneven hang, it looked like what it actually was. Home was a strange word. She'd been careful with it. She used it now, quietly, inside herself, where she didn't have to defend it yet. Teller's final report to the General Land Office came in December, 41 days after the Billings hearing. She read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with the snow coming down outside, and it was long and formally written and buried its most significant findings under layers of procedural language, which she translated automatically the way she translated everything. The fraudulent survey scheme had been traced to a land investment syndicate operating out of Denver, with operational reach across 4 territorial counties. The syndicate's local architect, the man who had created the survey template and coordinated the county office corruption, was a Denver attorney named Cosgrove, who had been managing the operation through intermediaries, including Whitmore and 4 other county officials across the territory. Crane, the Billings broker, had been a middle layer, acquiring land on behalf of the syndicate, knowing it was compromised but not involved in creating the documents. He'd be charged separately. Whitmore had agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for reduced charges. His cooperation had, according to Teller's notes, been immediate and comprehensive once the federal scope became clear to him. Men like Whitmore, she thought, always cooperated once cooperation was clearly the better option. That was the thing about functionaries. They had no loyalty to the enterprise, only to their own position within it. The Eastern Ridge and all disputed properties across the affected ranches were formally cleared. The suspended actions were withdrawn. The fraudulent survey documents were expunged from county records. She folded the report and looked at it for a moment. 41 days. 7 months of accumulated work, hers and Teller's and Pratt's, and Darnell riding in the cold asking the right questions of tired ranchers who'd stopped expecting anyone to ask. Colton was in the barn. She put on her coat and her boots and went out. The snow was coming down steadily, not heavy but consistent, the kind that would stick. The yard was already white, the fence posts wearing small caps of it, the mountains completely hidden behind cloud. She crossed to the barn and went inside where it was warmer and smelled of hay and horses and the particular animal closeness of a working barn in winter. Colton was mending a harness again. She'd come in on him doing exactly this weeks ago, the night she'd brought him the survey notice. The repetition felt significant in a way she couldn't quite articulate and didn't try to. She handed him the report. He read it standing up, turning pages carefully with the hand not holding the harness leather. When he finished, he looked up at her. "It's done," she said. He looked at the report for another moment. Then he set it on the workbench and went back to the harness, and she stood there. "That's it?" she said. "What else is there to say?" "Most people would say something. I'll say it later when I've thought about it." He pulled the leather through the buckle and checked the tension. "The Morrison family, the Kincaids, they know. Teller's office will notify them formally, but I'll write to them. They should hear it in plain language before they receive the official version." He nodded. "Josiah Pratt. I'll write to him too. He'll appreciate that. He likes being right." She almost smiled. "Most people do." She stood in the barn doorway for a moment longer, watching the snow come down in the yard. There was something she'd been carrying, not the legal weight, not the Harmon threat, those were specific and external, but something older and less definable, a held breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She breathed it out now, slowly, into the cold barn air. She'd arrived here with cracked ribs and a leather case that wasn't very heavy, and a letter from a man she didn't know. She'd arrived braced for the worst interpretation of everything, which had been, for years, the interpretation that kept her safest. She didn't know exactly when that had shifted. It hadn't been one moment. It had been the accumulation of small moments. Colton not looking at her the way she'd expected, the silence in the kitchen at 2 a.m. that had felt companionable instead of threatening, Heck's nod from the doorway, Darnell's earnest face taking notes, the Morrison woman's plain look of acknowledgement on the street after the hearing. Moments where the world had behaved differently than her experience had taught her to expect. That was the disorienting thing about safety. Not that it felt good. It did, eventually. But that it felt unfamiliar for a long time before it felt good. She'd spent months waiting for the catch, the condition, the thing she'd have to pay for it. She was starting to think there wasn't one. She wrote the letters that afternoon. To Pratt, to the Morrisons, to the Kincaids, and a longer one to Clara that took 3 drafts before she felt she'd said the true things in the right order. She told Clara the Billings hearing had gone in their favor. She told her the medical records had been the difference. She told her that she was sorry it had taken this long to be honest, and that she understood if Clara had questions she hadn't yet figured out how to ask. She sealed the letters and set them on the table to go out with the next post. Then she sat there for a while in the late afternoon quiet and thought about Gerald Harmon. Not with fear. That was the thing she noticed, the absence of the particular stomach tightening that his name had caused for months. She thought about him practically, the way she thought about weather or fence line repair. Something to manage, something to account for, not something to dread. He hadn't responded to the Billings ruling. Prescott hadn't written. The 2 practical men in new working clothes hadn't come back. Gerald was, she suspected, engaged in his reassessment, weighing the cost of continuing against the cost of cutting his losses and finding another way to recover what he'd spent. She thought he'd cut his losses. She might be wrong. She'd been wrong about men before, had read them wrong in exactly the direction of assuming they were better than they were. With Gerald, she was reading in the other direction, assuming he was more rational than his pride, and that was its own kind of guess. But she'd protected herself as well as she could. The documentation existed. The court ruling existed. Her position as a federal consulting partner was on record. If Gerald came back, she'd handle it, and she'd handle it better than she'd handled anything before because she was no longer doing it alone. That was new. The not alone part. She was still getting used to it. She told Colton about the Pennsylvania farmland on a Sunday in mid-December, when the snow had stopped and the cold had the particular clarity of a settled winter day, the mountains sharp-edged and white against a sky that was almost blue. They were walking the eastern fence line. The disputed 40 acres, her land now again. The ground frozen solid underfoot and the grass bent flat under snow. She'd asked to walk it with him, and he'd said yes without asking why, which was how he generally operated with her requests. "The Harmond estate," she said as they walked. "The property William left me. Clara has been managing it through a local agent since I left." He waited. "I had been thinking of selling it," she said. "The house especially. Too many bad associations and no practical use for a house in Pittsburgh when I'm in Montana." "That's reasonable." "The farmland is different." She stopped at a corner post and looked out across the white field. "It's 80 acres. Good soil," Claire says. "It's been rented to a tenant farmer for 3 years and the rent is modest but consistent." She looked at it. "I'd like to keep it. As a holding. Something that remains mine. Not used for anything in particular. Just there." He stood beside her looking at the same white field. "Because of your father," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked at him. He was watching the field. "He built his practice from nothing," she said. "He used to say that he said a man, he was old-fashioned about it, but he meant a person, needed one thing that was entirely theirs, that belonged to them not because someone gave it to them, but because they'd earned it, or fought for it, or simply refused to let it go." She paused. "The farmland was his, before it was my husband's, and before it was mine. He'd bought it the year before he died. He never got to do anything with it." "Then keep it," Colton said simply. It doesn't affect anything here. The ranch's accounts." "Abigail." He looked at her. "Keep it." She looked back at the field. "All right," she said. They walked the rest of the fence line without saying much, checking posts where the frost heave had loosened them, and she noted 2 that would need resetting in spring, and Colton noted 3, and they compared notes at the north corner and found they'd identified 5 distinct problem points between them, and the mundane practicality of it was something she valued in a way she couldn't entirely explain to anyone who hadn't spent years in circumstances where the mundane wasn't available. Ordinary things. Ordinary, unambiguous things. She had come to understand that they were not small. The question Colton asked her came not dramatically, but in the way most things came between them, practically and without ceremony, on a Wednesday evening in January when the temperature had dropped enough that the inside of the kitchen windows were fogging and the fire needed feeding every few hours. He came in from checking the cattle, and she was doing accounts, the ranch books, which she'd fully taken over in November, and which were, if she was being accurate, considerably better organized than they'd been. And he poured himself coffee and stood at the counter for a moment. Then he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand I'm not asking it because I expect a particular answer. You can say whatever you actually think." She put down her pen. "All right." He looked at his coffee. "The arrangement we have. You came here to a thing that might have been a marriage, and we haven't talked about whether it is one. Legally. We filed the paperwork in October. We did. But that was partly for standing purposes. Your name. Yes. I want to know if—" He stopped, tried again. "If it's a thing you want to continue, not because of the legal complications, or the Harmons, or the federal case. Those are done, or close enough to done." He looked at her. "Because you want to. If you don't, I meant what I said in the letter. You can go wherever you like. I'll help you establish wherever that is." She looked at him for a long moment. He was, she thought, about as imperfect as a person could be in a way that added up to something decent. He was too quiet, sometimes to the point of opacity. He'd built walls around himself that were structural now, not just protective. She could see places where he'd meant to let them down and found he'd forgotten how. He had a temper he managed carefully, and she'd seen the edges of it twice, both times at the cattle, both times controlled. But there. He was bad at being sick, which she'd discovered when he had a head cold in November and became considerably more difficult to be around than usual, and would not admit to either the illness or the difficulty. He had opinions about the right way to stack firewood that were frankly not worth the energy he gave them. She knew his flaws. They were concrete and specific, and she had cataloged them the way she cataloged everything, because she'd learned that you saw people clearly or you saw them wrong. She also knew that he had driven carefully on the ride back from Pratt's to spare her ribs he'd never acknowledged knowing about. That he had come back from checking cattle in the dark to sit with her the night before the October hearing because she couldn't sleep. That he had stood in a courtroom gallery in November without being asked to and without making anything of it afterward. That he had read a letter about what her marriage had been and said all right and meant it in the most practical and complete way she'd encountered that word used. "Colton," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not going anywhere." He held her look for a moment. "All right," he said. And then, because he was the man he was, he turned and fed the fire and came back to the table and looked at the account she'd been working on and said, "The Billings feed supplier is still overcharging us. I've been meaning to say." She looked at the column he was pointing at. "I know. I've been building the comparison documentation to take to them in the spring." "Good." He sat down across from her. She picked up her pen. The fire settled. Outside, the Montana winter pressed against the walls with the patient indifference of something that had been there long before either of them, and would be there long after. And inside, the kitchen was warm and lit, and the accounts were in order, and two people who had both arrived at their own lives with significant damage sat across a table from each other, which was not a story anyone would call romantic, but was, she thought, the truest kind of thing. Spring came late to the valley that year, reluctant, the snow holding on through March and into early April before it finally gave way. When the thaw came, it came all at once, the creek running fast and muddy, the fence post standing in soft ground, the eastern ridge turning from white to brown to the first pale suggestion of green over the course of 2 weeks. She walked up to that ridge on a Saturday in April, not for any practical reason. She had plenty of practical reasons to be elsewhere. Accounts and correspondence and 2 letters from Teller's office she hadn't answered yet, but because she wanted to stand on it. The 40 acres that had nearly been taken. The ground someone had looked at on a map in Denver and decided could be manufactured away from a man who'd worked it for 7 years. It was just a ridge. Grass coming back, rocks showing through where the snow had scoured, a hawk doing large, slow circles above the draw to the east. Nothing remarkable from any angle but this one, the one where she knew what it had taken to keep it. She heard boots on the frozen ground behind her and didn't turn around. She knew his walk. Colton came up and stood beside her and looked at the same view. "Darnell let the south gate open again," he said. "I know, I heard the cattle. He's going to give me gray hair." "You already have gray hair." "More than." She looked at the hawk. It had caught a thermal and was rising now, going up in a long, unhurried spiral. She'd been thinking up here on the ridge about the woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach in October, the one with the cracked ribs and the single bag, and the letter folded soft at the creases. She'd been braced for everything to go wrong, and things had gone wrong, exactly the way things do. Not all at once, but in a series, each new problem arriving before the previous one was entirely resolved. That was how it actually worked. Not the clean narrative of struggle and resolution, but the messy, ongoing accumulation of one thing after another, with the periods of breathing room brief and the work never entirely finished. She'd handled it, not well every time. There had been nights she'd sat at the kitchen table at 2 a.m, not because she was working, but because the fear had woken her and she hadn't wanted anyone to see it. There had been a moment in the Billings hearing, before she stood up, when her legs had been uncertain in a way she would not admit to anyone. There had been the day Prescott left the ranch when she'd stood at the kitchen window for 10 minutes, unable to think about anything, just standing there. And she hadn't cataloged that as strength. She'd cataloged it as what happened when you ran hard for a long time. She was not a story about a remarkable woman. She was a woman who had done what was necessary because the alternative was unacceptable, and who had been helped at several important junctures by people who had no particular obligation to help her. A surveyor in a cluttered cabin, a federal investigator who had his own reasons, a young ranch hand who rode in the cold asking the right questions, an old man who positioned himself by a barn door without being asked, Colton, who had written a letter saying he wasn't the kind of man who held people to things they didn't want and had kept that promise in every direction she'd tested it. Her father had told her once, near the end, that the measure of a life wasn't what you achieved in the good years, but what you chose in the hard ones. She'd been young enough to think it was a thing fathers said. She understood it differently now, not as a maxim, but as a description of how it actually felt. the hard years and the choices in them, the accumulation of small decisions that added up to a direction, a person, a life. She was 30 years old. She had been frightened for a long time. She had also been, she could see from this ridge on a cold April morning, more capable than any version of her circumstances had allowed her to demonstrate until she found ground where demonstrating it was possible. That was the thing she hadn't expected. Not that someone would save her. She'd stopped waiting for that in the first year of her marriage, but that there was a version of her life where her own capabilities were simply received, used, valued in the straightforward way that work was valued when the person doing it was seen clearly. She had not known that was available to her. She knew it now. "The Kincaid brothers wrote," she said. "The restoration paperwork on their parcel is finalized. They want to have us to dinner." "When?" "They suggested May." "That works." "They specifically requested I come." She paused. "They want to ask me about the filing process. They have a cousin with a similar situation in another county." He looked at her. "I told them I'd think about it," she said. "And?" She looked at the ridge. The hawk was gone, climbed too high to see against the pale sky. "Teller asked me the same thing, essentially, consulting on a more permanent basis. There are people across this territory who need the kind of help I can give them and who don't have access to it." She stopped. "It would mean travel sometimes. Billings, maybe farther." "I know. It's not what we—" She stopped. "It's more than what we discussed." "We didn't discuss much," he said. "We've been mostly just doing things." That was accurate. That was, she supposed, entirely accurate. "Does it bother you?" she said. "What I want to do." He considered it in the way he considered things. Not performing consideration, but actually doing it. "No," he said. "You're better at it than most people are at anything. Seems like a waste not to use it." He looked at the ridge. "The accounts will still be here when you get back." She looked at him. "Also," he said, "you're better at the accounts than I am, so I'd appreciate if you'd set up a system I can follow when you're away." She almost laughed. Not the suppressed exhale kind. An actual laugh, brief and real, that surprised her when it came out. "I'll make you a very clear system," she said. "Much appreciated." They stood on the ridge for a few more minutes. Below them, the ranch sat in its ordinary configurations. The house, the barn, the cattle moving in the south pasture where Darnell had presumably gotten the gate back under control. The fence lines running their parallel courses across the land that was theirs, legally and formally, and now completely. The eastern ridge was green at the bottom and brown at the top, and the sky above it was the enormous pale blue of a Montana spring morning, and Abigail Turner Briggs stood in the middle of it and felt the cold air on her face and her ribs, which had been healed since January, and the absence of the held breath she'd been carrying since before she could accurately remember starting to carry it. She had arrived here looking for refuge, a place to disappear into, to be small enough in, to survive. She'd understood that about herself even at the time, and hadn't been ashamed of it, because survival was a legitimate objective when survival was what was required. But somewhere in the months between October and now, the objective had changed. Not because anything had been given to her. Nothing had been given. It had all been worked for, negotiated for, documented and argued and built one careful step at a time. But because the work had shown her something she'd lost track of, in the years of managing and enduring and holding herself carefully so that nothing else could break. She was not someone who had been through hard things. She was someone who had come through them. There was a difference. The first was a category, a damage report. The second was a direction, a motion, something ongoing rather than finished. She was still going. That was the thing. She was not the sum of what had been done to her. She was not the body that had been judged insufficient, not the wife who hadn't managed to make a bad marriage good, not the woman who'd run. She was someone who could find a 60-foot elevation discrepancy in a fraudulent survey document and understand what it meant. Someone who could walk into a room full of hostile commissioners and lay down evidence in the right order. Someone who could write a letter that a federal investigator called organized work. She was someone who had built something, not alone, not without cost, not without the specific generosity of people who had not been obligated to help her, but built, nonetheless, with her own hands and her father's education and her own hard-won understanding of what things were actually worth. The farmland in Pennsylvania still existed. 80 acres of good soil rented to a tenant farmer, sitting quietly in her name. She'd decided what to do with the rent money. She'd write to Clara and ask her to make sure it was managed into something that grew rather than just sat, something her father would have approved of. She thought she knew what he would have said, standing on this ridge. He would have said, "Good, now what's next?" She turned and looked at Colton. "We should get back." "Darnell," he agreed. They walked down off the ridge together, through the thawing grass, toward the house with its slightly uneven kitchen window, and its east wall that had needed caulking since October, and would probably need it again by next October, toward the table covered in papers and the accounts waiting to be finished, and the letters from Teller's office she hadn't answered yet, toward the work of an ordinary life, which was not a small thing, which was, she had come to understand, precisely the point. The ranch sat below them in the April morning, real and impermanent in theirs, and the sky went on above it further than she could see, and Abigail walked toward home with her ribs healed and her hands steady and her face turned forward. She was not done. She was not finished becoming what she was going to be. She was at last simply here. And here, after everything, was enough.